Well, good evening. I have a particular memory of Lake Stevens. I almost drowned in your lake at 5 years old. My dad saved me from drowning in this lake, and I've never been back since until last night. Anyway, I quickly went over this talk this afternoon, and I was surprised in how ambitious I made it. There's a lot of slides I have in here, so I'm going to move kind of fast. And I'm not going to get off in too many rabbit trails, which I like to do, the fun rabbit trails, but I'm going to kind of keep it tight, I hope. Anyway, the title of this is Whatever Happened to the Dinosaurs? Well, here's the talk overview. First of all, we need to define what a dinosaur is. Most of you know that, but there's a specific definition to distinguish that from a lizard. And we're not the only ones, creation scientists are not the only ones that have problems with dinosaurs. The evolutionists have problems with dinosaurs too, and I'm going to point out some of their problems. And of course, the major problem they have, we don't necessarily have this problem, is how did they go extinct? And then I'm going to talk about a really challenging piece of data. By the way, the Lord has led me over 50 years of creation research to answer challenges that they give us, not necessarily to challenge evolution and give talks on evolution, because I found that's pretty easy. There are lots of evidence against evolution. So he's led me to answer their questions like, what about the Ice Age, which is my primary area? Can the flood do this? So forth. So one of the most challenging piece of evidence about dinosaurs is how are dinosaur tracks, eggs, nests, and scavenged bone beds explained in the early flood? They have to be alive before the peak of the flood, in the chaos of the floodwaters. Well, how do you form these things? Well, I believe I got a good answer for that. And then finally, were dinosaurs on the ark? And if they were on the ark, that meant that they came off the ark. So we'll talk about all this. Anyway, the secular people think dinosaurs are great for reeling in your children, teach them about millions of years in evolution. Yeah, they use dinosaurs. One of my oldest grandson was interested in dinosaurs. He checked out a book at the public kindergarten on dinosaurs, and it talked about evolution in millions of years in kindergarten. That's what we're up against. That's why we have all those resources out there for information for you and your children and grandchildren so that they don't get blown away by the culture. But we can use dinosaurs also as missionary lizards. We can use them. So what is a dinosaur? Well, essentially it's a reptile that walks with its legs straight. Well, lizards, they're out like this. Crocodiles, lizards. That seems to be the main definition between the two. But of course, dinosaurs are extinct, or at least we think they're extinct now. There's always some rumors that they might be alive in the Congo somewhere, but I'm not going to get into that. But that's the main difference of what a dinosaur is. Right there. And dinosaurs were made on day 6. Genesis 1:25 says, and God made the beasts of the earth according to its kind, cattle according to its kind, and everything that creeps on the earth according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. So dinosaurs were created on day 6. They lived with man before the flood. But before man sinned, everything was a vegetarian. All these animals were vegetarians. They ate meat. There was no death before man sinned. So it was a paradise in which every animal ate plants. And here's some of the dinosaurs. Now, these dinosaurs are given different names because their little skulls are a little different and their tails may be longer. In general, they're called Diplodocus or Brachiosaurus. How many have heard of Brontosaurus? Now, supposedly, that is no longer a dinosaur. That name is supposedly axed out because in the heat of this competition to find these dinosaur fossils, they got the wrong head on a dinosaur they called Brontosaurus, and 100 years later they discovered it, and so they said, well, Brontosaurus is no more. So I've heard some people want to bring it back. So a lot of you probably didn't know that little tidbit. Oh, I can't get off on that rabbit trail. So yeah, they had the wrong head for 100 years. Anyway, they also find big ones. They call them Seismosaurus, Ultrasaurus. I mean, they got a lot of names for essentially one type of animal that had some variety. Oops, how did I get into that? I went the wrong way. Okay, and then we have our friend the Triceratops, 3 horns in the front. And then we have, of course, what everyone knows, T-Rex, those little tiny arms which are not quite sure what they do. And Stegosaurus, which is a very unique dinosaur, very unique, small head, spikes. They don't know what these things are. They think they might be cooling fins for when it's hot. Anyway, a Velociraptor, which I believe was in the first Jurassic Park, was it not? And then we have Ankylosaurus, which these are actually pretty big dinosaurs, I think 30 feet long, built like a tank. And then we have these Pachycephalosaurus that supposedly butted heads, like bighorn sheep, where I live in Montana. But research has shown that they couldn't have done that, because if they did this, they'd crack their skulls open. So they didn't do that, so they don't know why they had such thick skulls. And of course, we have a lot of small dinosaurs, this one being the smallest one, Compsognathus. I can't quite pronounce it, but anyway, that's it right there. And then we have some marine reptiles. These are not officially dinosaurs. They call them marine reptiles. They lived supposedly at the same time as the dinosaurs, Plesiosaur being the most common one. And then you have the Mosasaur, which would be like the T-Rex of the oceans. It was a pretty vicious, large marine reptile that's extinct. At least we hope it is. And then you had all these flying reptiles, Pteranodon being one, and other types of things similar to this. So those were the dinosaurs. So what problems do evolutionists have? They challenge us with problems, but do they have problems with dinosaurs? Yeah. Here are 3. These are only 3 I'm going to talk about. They don't know where they come from. They evolved from some reptile, they believe, but they find a candidate, but 5 years later, it doesn't quite work out, so they axe that candidate. So they don't really know where it supposedly came from. Number 2, they're finding a lot of dinosaurs in polar areas now. So that brings up a whole new paradigm of what do you think of dinosaurs living in snowy areas? I got some great interesting quotes by secular scientists on this conundrum for them. And number 3, they're finding a lot of unfossilized bones with soft tissue, which brings up a huge amount of problems for them. But, so I'm going to flesh out some of these 3. Here's a quote from The Origin of Dinosaurs from a book, the Natural History Museum Book of Dinosaurs. Where did dinosaurs come from? That apparently simple question has been the subject of intense debate among scientists for 150 years. Essentially, they don't know. And they're like any organism we see in the fossil record. And by the way, we have billions of fossils out there. But like any organism, they suddenly appear with no ancestors. That's typical of the fossil record. It's called the gaps in the fossil record, and it's universal in the fossil record. Strong evidence against evolution. Because evolution, to progress, supposedly gets new information, new organs, new structures, and it has to be slow and gradual, because if you get too big of a change by mutations, it'll kill the organisms. You've got to only have slight changes, you see. So you should see these chain of organisms from one type to another in the fossil record, and you don't see any of that. And for the second part, they're finding them in polar areas now. Now, this is an old slide I made for one of my resources back there. you find dinosaur tracks on Spitsbergen, right here, about 80 degrees north latitude. Dinosaur tracks. Down here you can see the tracks. If you see a track like that, it means it's a track. If you see a dinosaur, it's a dinosaur. So here's Siberia. They find them in Siberia. And there's actually dinosaurs found on Greenland, and there's actually tracks found on Greenland that I don't have there. And there's dinosaur fossils found in the Queen Elizabeth Islands of northeast Canada. And in Alaska, there's lots of dinosaurs and dinosaur tracks in northern Alaska, central Alaska, and southwest Alaska, and even in Canada. So this really has put a trip on secular scientists to explain dinosaurs living in polar areas. And in the southern hemisphere, you find them in two places in Antarctica, right here and on the Antarctic Peninsula, and in places that they believe by plate tectonics were in the polar areas. New Zealand, they believe, was in the polar areas, and they find dinosaurs in New Zealand, dinosaur fossils. And the Chatham Islands, they find dinosaur fossils in Southeast Australia, which they believe were in polar latitudes. So this brings up a lot of mysteries to them, and here's a few interesting quotes from evolutionary scientists. Michael Benton says, "Should we now imagine dinosaurs as thermally insulated, warm-blooded animals that plowed through snowdrifts and scraped the ice off the ground to find food?" You can see he's frustrated. And here's another one by Rich and Patricia Vickers-Rich, Dinosaurs of Darkness, which the book is all on polar dinosaurs. They say the picture of dinosaurs that were active in a country where permafrost and that consequently experienced winter temperatures, which only a few mammals tolerate today, is a very different one than the popular perception of all dinosaurs as denizens of steaming tropical swamps. Another quote is, "What are they going to eat up there in the polar areas? Even if polar dinosaurs were able to subsist on poor quality food for some time, a photosynthetic crisis of some duration would have been fatal to them because even this food resource would have become exhausted." There's not enough food up there and it's dark for months. So how do they solve this? Well, they don't know. Maybe that's one of the motivations for them to invent this idea of feathered dinosaurs, which some creation scientists think that some dinosaurs had feathers on them, others do not. I would lean towards that they do not, but right now, from what I read on a creationist chat, is that it's controversial. Anyway, I'm staying out of that controversial issue. And the third thing, they find a lot of soft tissue now in dinosaurs. In fact, they find blood vessels and red blood cells in dinosaur bones, unfossilized. And we know blood cells, all this soft tissue decays rapidly. So what's going on? Could these be millions of years ago old? They believe dinosaurs went extinct 65 million years ago. Well, how can you find all this soft tissue that's not fossilized? And by the way, it's not a necessarily rare find. The Creation Research Society, which I used to be a board member, we've done our own dinosaur digs in southeast Montana, and we got a Triceratops horn. And inside it, we had found soft tissues. We found bone cells, unfossilized bone cells. And, you know, none of these protein molecules and blood cells can last more than a couple thousand years at the best. So how would they exist for 65 million years? So they got a real problem, and the major researcher on this is Mary Schweitzer, who was a doctoral student at Montana State University in Bozeman, where I live. And she wrote her PhD on this. Anyway, this is some of her statements. She said, when they're doing the research, a thin slice of T-Rex bone glowed amber beneath the lens of my microscope. blood vessel channels snake through a bone matrix, and tiny chambers known as lacunae, which house bone-forming cells, appeared as small ovals. Then a colleague took one look at them and shouted, "You've got red blood cells. You've got red blood cells." How long do you think blood's going to last? It has to be buried rapidly and preserved, not millions of years, thousands of years at best. So this is one piece of evidence that those millions of years don't really exist. And she continued, "It was exactly like looking at a slice of modern bone, but of course I couldn't believe it. I said to the lab technician, the bones, after all, are 65 million years old. How could blood cells survive that long?" Well, maybe they don't. Maybe their dating methods are all way off. Indeed, I think that is the case. And here is some of the tissue. You can stretch it like this because it's still soft. Here's some of those red blood cells. See, my cursor does show up, doesn't it? Yeah. And here's a blood vessel, and this is some of the soft tissue. So they got major problems with dinosaurs. And you need to know about it so that you can present this to people that are influenced by these dinosaur fossils that they present and put and use millions of years and evolution they throw into it. So let's talk about how they went extinct. This is really entertaining. There's about 100 theories on how they went extinct. Some of them are very entertaining, and we'll get into some of those. And brains were too small. Have you heard that one before? Other animals ate their eggs. Disease or glandular disorders. In other words, the vegetation evolved, supposedly, and they couldn't digest it. And they died out. Cosmic rays from a supernova, which is an exploding star. Changes in the magnetic field of the Earth, a meteor impact, which was considered a long shot 40 years ago. A long shot. And of course, there's a lot of different ones on this one. Drastic changes in the climate all over the Earth. There's about 10 theories having to do with climate change for the dinosaurs. And here's one right here about the small brains. We know that Stegosaurus has the brain the size of a walnut. And of course, that's probably one of his problems. The picture's bleak, gentlemen. The world's climates are changing. The mammals are taking over. And we all have a brain about the size of a walnut. Oh, no. And of course, indigestion is one of them. From vegetation that changed, evolved supposedly, and they couldn't digest it. How about diet of air pollution? Maybe too much carbon dioxide or too much oxygen, or there's about 10 theories just dealing with climate change on these dinosaurs. They just simply starved to death. Chronic constipation. These are serious theories. And of course, an asteroid impact theory is one of them. This is actually the latest one. How many have heard of this asteroid impact theory for the demise of the dinosaurs? Probably a good amount of you. So that's the current theory right now. And of course, the trouble is the dinosaurs went extinct, but a lot of animals that should have went extinct, like crocodiles, very climate sensitive, and turtles, didn't go extinct. So why did just the dinosaurs go extinct when these other animals should have went extinct at the same time? Well, they don't know. Anyway, here's a quote from a scientist on the meteorite impact. This meteorite impact idea is still controversial. They're not sure how it would kill off the dinosaurs, possibly blasting up all kinds of particles up in the stratosphere, with the sun bouncing off of them and causing a cooling called impact winter. And sort of like nuclear winter, if we had a lot of nuclear weapons go off, you would put particles in the stratosphere, cool the Earth from the sunlight reflected back to space from these particles. Anyway, the paleontologists, those who study fossils, really don't like this theory because they claim the dinosaurs were dying out anyway, you see. So we don't think they died out right at 65 million years ago because of a meteorite impact in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. So there's controversy. And like this quote here says everyone has their own favorite mechanism, says Zonley. We don't know the facts, so you can operate on your own intuition. So essentially, they really don't know when you get into it. This is how I believe they went extinct. That's the real reason. So you young people, don't take up smoking or you're liable to go extinct. Anyway, a lot of people think they haven't gone extinct. They just evolved into birds. Well, you know, Answers in Genesis has a lot of interesting cartoons thinking about this. Okay, they evolved into birds. Let's think about this. Well, was there a Humiosaurus at one time? What about a Turkeysaurus rex? And of course, flight is a significant thing if they're going to change into birds. So just think of on their little tiny arms or whatever, they get a little bump. That's maybe the first chance of a feather forming. Well, you got to try it out, right? You got to try it out. You got to learn to fly. So here he goes. He's going to try it. Crash. Experiment over. You know, there is a huge difference between a scale and a feather. If you don't believe me, get a DVD by Dr. David Menton from Answers in Genesis that shows you how complicated scales and feathers are and how different they are and how one could not evolve into the other. I mean, he shows you micrographs from scanning electron micrographs of all this stuff, and it's just an amazing feature. I think has anyone seen that DVD? Yeah, Tim has, and it's a great DVD. Every reasonable imaginable for dinosaur extinction except the flood. Except the flood. It's because we live in a secular culture that rejects the Bible, and they have to explain everything coming about without God. Everything. The universe has to come about without God. Stars, galaxies, and they got all kinds of these evolutionary ideas in these, even though every step of the way there's problems with their ideas. And then stars explode, and then the dust comes back together, and then you form another star and explodes. You know, the sun has done it 2 times before. The sun is a third-generation star. It's the third time around. And then finally, you know, as it collapses from a cloud of debris, you get planets forming, and which is a very difficult thing, by the way. Finally, on the Earth, you get it cooled down from a hot blob to a soupy sea of chemicals. Chemicals got together, formed that first cell. Chemical evolution is exceedingly difficult. They haven't even made any progress in 60 years in thinking about this. But anyway, everything but the flood could account for the extinction of the dinosaurs. But when you look at the bone beds and dinosaur fossils, you discover quite a few interesting things about them. Most of them are buried by water. Think floods. Many are in marine rocks, which is what you'd expect in the Genesis flood. And there's some dinosaur graveyards, bone beds. Some of them are huge. There's one in Montana, west of where I used to live in Great Falls, Montana, that has 10,000 duck-billed dinosaurs of the same species in a small volume, 3 feet thick, 2 miles southwest-northeast, and a half a mile going northwest southeast. There's west of Choteau, Montana. 10,000, all the same species. Now, how would that occur in, say, a local flood or something like that? It gives you the idea this is a monstrous catastrophe that at least buried them. And by the way, there are some big dinosaur graveyards all over the world. China has a lot of good ones, a lot of big ones. Alberta has some big ones. Some of them are over 10,000 dinosaurs in one bone bed. Now that's catastrophism. That doesn't sound like any local flood that's going to bury all these dinosaurs. Also, you have to rapidly fossilize these things, or are they going to decay? And the flood can rapidly fossilize organisms. Well, today fossilization is very rare because you don't have the right conditions hardly ever. You got to bury it rapidly. And for bones or soft tissue, you got to especially preserve those. But bones, you got to, the organic matter has to be changed into chemicals from the outside. The chemicals come in from the outside. And it has to happen rapidly before the bone decays. And the right chemicals have to come in. So it's very rare today, but the flood can produce them really fast because of the conditions of the flood. And these bone beds, like I say, many are the same species. If we have a catastrophe today somewhere, the organisms, unfortunately, that are going to die are going to be a variety of organisms, not just one species of dinosaur. So these are really strange features of bone beds. Also in these bone beds, you have rare babies or young dinosaurs. There's hardly any of them. Why not? Now, when there's a catastrophe in Africa and elephants are killed, you bury all ages of dinosaurs, young and old, and you find them together. But with dinosaurs, babies and young juvenile dinosaurs are rare. Could it be that the reason you don't find these is because they were unable to flee the encroaching floodwaters and they died right away? And the bigger dinosaurs were able to escape and live for a while and make tracks, lay eggs, etc. Now, we'll get into that. But here's a bone bed. This is a bone bed in New Mexico, a coliferous graveyard of about over 1,000, all mashed together, about 1,000 of them. And here is a Dinosaur National Monument where you have bones of all sorts, kind of in almost a random matrix, random within sandstone. So this is typical of what you find in a lot of bone beds. And then the descriptions of some of these bone beds are like you'd expect in a monstrous flood. Like here's some quotes from men who've studied and dug dinosaurs. Edmund Colbert, piled in like logs in a jam. It sounds like a pretty good catastrophe. And John Horner, Montana State University, in digging dinosaurs, talking about that bone bed of 10,000 dinosaurs, said this was no ordinary spring flood from one of the streams in the area, but a catastrophic inundation. They use the words of catastrophe often to describe the burial of dinosaurs. And this I found on my own in a dinosaur bone bed of over 1,000 dinosaurs in northeast Wyoming. This is the rock layer. It's kind of a mudstone, and these are pieces of bone all this way. These dinosaurs were pulverized, totally pulverized. That's quite a catastrophe, and their bones were dispersed into the mud, becoming mudstone. So I talked about what is a dinosaur. Essentially, its legs go straight down. Some of the problems for evolutionists, how they went extinct, which is actually another problem for evolutionists. I could have included that in problems for evolutionists. Now I'm going to get into the challenging dinosaur observations for creation scientists and Christians. How do we explain dinosaur tracks, eggs, dinosaur nests, and scavenged bone beds early in the flood? Now, a lot of people think that the early flood was catastrophe and powerful currents and turbulence everywhere over the earth. No, that's not true at all. It was like this in some areas, But you had a variety of areas. You had some calm areas as well as very turbulent areas. So their image of the flood is not correct to start with. So let's go into these. A lot of bone beds have been scavenged by carnivorous dinosaurs like T-Rex and other ones. How do we know? This is a bone found on the Blackfeet Indian Reservation in north central Montana, and you can see the teeth marks on this bone right here. And then in a lot of these bone beds, you find the teeth of T-Rex and other dinosaurs, but only the teeth. The rest of the skeleton is not buried in the bone bed, which means that they were scavenging, eating on them. And of course, these dinosaurs lose teeth easy. They break off and new ones form. So they're always breaking teeth. When they hit something hard, a tooth breaks off. So we find their teeth in the bone beds. It means those bone beds were scavenged. In other words, those dinosaurs were dead with flesh on them, and these carnivorous dinosaurs were still around, and they chomped on them and tried to eat. Also, we find a lot of dinosaur tracks. And here's one that I took from northeast Wyoming. This is a three-toed carnivorous dinosaur. It's called a theropod. That's a general category of a dinosaur. Theropods are the carnivorous meat eaters that generally have three toes, like T-Rex is one. This is from a small one like Velociraptor. And now this is from a large duck-billed dinosaur. The track was about that wide, found on the top of a coal mine in Utah. Found on top of coal in Utah? By the way, they are found on the tops of coal mines in Colorado, Wyoming, the United Kingdom, and Queensland, Australia. So, although it's a very rare phenomenon, and it's found here and there, what are dinosaur tracks doing on the top of a coal mine? Well, if I don't forget, I'll probably get into that and tell you as we go on. Anyway, here's a plot. This is plot of dinosaur tracks. By the way, before about 1980, they never found any dinosaur tracks. They were almost non-existent in the rocks, the sedimentary rocks. But now there are actually millions of dinosaur tracks, millions. And here's the areas where they're found. They find them every year. This is an old slide from about the late 1990s. And there's a lot more tracks over the world. So that's where we find them. Quite a few places. There's none in Washington as far as I know. So how would we explain this data? This appears to be live dinosaurs just living in their environment and then covered up by a flood of some sort to preserve the tracks. But you know, when I researched this, I found a lot of unusual features if these dinosaurs lived in their natural environment. First of all, I discovered that tracks of likely poor swimmers are rare. Poor swimmers, which ones are those? Well, Stegosaurus, do you think that can swim very well? Triceratops with that big, heavy, bony plate. Its head would go down first and it would drown. Ankylosaurus, they're poor swimmers. Those tracks are rare. We find a lot of duck-billed dinosaur tracks and a lot of carnivorous theropod tracks. And then practically all the tracks are from adults and older juveniles. We don't find hardly any baby or young juvenile tracks. Why is that? Because in Africa, when you see tracks of elephant, you find tracks of big elephants and then small ones all together. This is rather unusual for track features. And then this one especially caught my eye. Practically all the dinosaur trackways they find, a trackway is defined as 2 or more individual tracks. The trackways are, and sometimes you find 100 of these tracks in a trackway. They're either straight or gently curved. They hardly ever take sharp corners. I hunt elk in Montana, and when I'm tracking elk in the snow, when they're not bothered. They generally move in a straight line until I get close and I spook them and zigzag all over the place. So the fact that why are they all so straight? If they were moseying around eating and feeding, they would be making sharp corners too. But could it be they were fleeing from the encroaching floodwaters, trying to flee, and when you flee, you go straight out? Okay, well, let's think about that. Also, when you find trackways, they're on flat bedding planes of sedimentary rocks. They don't seem to jump from one bedding plane to another, as if there are no hills there. There's always on a flat bedding plane. They don't climb hills. And then in one place, I'm thinking of northeast Wyoming, you find tracks on different layers in the area, separated by maybe, I can't remember the number, maybe 100 meters. But in northeast Wyoming, it's the same types of dinosaur tracks at the lower level as the upper level. And they give it a separation of 3 million years. So what's the odds of the same dinosaur coming to the same area making tracks 3 million years later, the same type of dinosaur makes another track 3 million years later in the same area? So I don't think that's probable at all. But these are some of the unusual track features that kind of made me think, well, we need to think of a different idea with the flood in mind. Here's a trackway right here. There's actually two more that were up in this area that were eroded. And eggs. They found some eggs in Mongolia in the 1920s, but they didn't see any in the sedimentary rocks until about the 1980s in Montana. And now they find them in quite a few different areas of the world. This is an old slide from the late 1990s. There's a lot more dinosaur eggs. Actually, there are considered to be millions of dinosaur eggs. What are dinosaur eggs being doing in sedimentary rocks in the flood? How would we explain these? Well, I took a look at the data a little closer. You've got to look at this data close. Oops. I found from the eggs nest structures, which would be hollows or with vegetation piled up. Those are almost non-existent. They're laid on flat bedding planes, flat surfaces. And nest structures, real nest structures, there are some, but there's probably less than a dozen real nest structures. So they didn't apparently make nests. Maybe they didn't have time to make a nest because of the flood. Maybe they found a little bit of land and just laid their eggs quickly and off they went before the flood caught up with them. And no vegetation is piled on top. We don't find any pollen or anything like that. We find a lot of pollen in plant fossils in the fossil record, but we don't find them hardly ever, if ever, associated with dinosaur eggs. And like I said, they're laid on flat bedding plane, although the eggs are porous. Dinosaur eggs are quite porous, so if they're laid flat like that, they're going to dry out in a very short time. No dinosaur mother would do that because they instinctively would make a nest. Maybe they did not have time to make a nest, and they had to lay their eggs quickly and get out of there. Presenting some possibilities. So I developed what's called the BEDS hypothesis. BEDS stands for briefly exposed diluvial sediments. Diluvial is another name for the flood. Briefly exposed. Well, how does this work during the flood? Well, we find that a lot of these dinosaur areas are in areas of thick sediments. They're on top of maybe 5,000, 10,000 feet of sedimentary rocks. They're found in areas of thick sediments. And there's evidence there's a lot of erosion after they're laid down. It was piled, more sediments are piled up, and then they're eroded, probably from the recessional stage of the flood, eroded the top off down to the level we see them today. So why the BEDS hypothesis? Well, as you pile up sediments really thick in the flood in one area, the bottom of the flood waters and the top are going to kind of converge. And the flood wasn't a 371-day event where the water rose and gently sank. The water was going up and down like this as it was rising from 5 different mechanisms, tides being one of the most obvious ones, but there's 4 other ones that I know of. There's probably even more. Sea level will oscillate, or I should say flood level will oscillate. That's why I put it sea level in quotes. And local drops in the sea level will expose a flat bedding plane of freshly laid sediments. And on those sediments, dinosaurs in the water, or maybe in higher land nearby, can embark on these sediments and make tracks, lay eggs, scavenge dead dinosaurs, all on a flat bedding plane that was just recently exposed with a local drop in the flood levels. And then you have a rise that'll cover it up with muddy sediments and preserve it. You got to preserve all this material by covering it up rapidly. Tracks won't last more than a week, usually, before they start decaying. So here's a kind of a schematic to drive this home. These are T, stands for time. Time T1 is T1, then after a little while, it could be hours, it could be a few days, time 2, then time 3. So it's areas of rapid sedimentation and areas of thick sedimentary rocks today. So the top of the sediments are collecting sediment really quick, and finally at time T3, it's shallow. And then guess what? Then you have a sudden drop. And then these are block diagrams, by the way, you can extend these for 100 miles this way. So this would cover a large area. These are just slices, a block diagram they call them. So you have a local fall in the sediments, maybe due to low tide. And tides during the flood would probably be huge. And therefore you got exposed sediments up there. And then they can make the tracks, lay eggs, eat dead dinosaurs there, and then the local rise will cover up what they did, the eggs, and to put them in the sedimentary rocks, and so on and so forth as the sediments pile up thick. So here's a little schematic. Just think of this area as 100 miles wide. This is just a schematic to make a point. A local drop in sea level, that's what these down arrows mean. Exposing a flat bedding plane. They make tracks, lay eggs. And then guess what? It rises again, and it should have driven them off, but in this case, the artist kept them there. But it covers up their eggs, their tracks, with a layer of sediment. And then it can happen again. So you can have different levels in an area of tracks and eggs. So that's kind of an idea of how it would work. And here's 5 mechanisms to cause the level of the floodwaters to go up and down like this. And lunar tides being the most obvious one, twice a day, going up and down. And there's 4 other ones, which I'm not going to go into much. And so actually making good time. I can probably get off on some rabbit trails. Okay, let's see. We're actually on our 5th one. We're dinosaurs on the ark. What do you think? Okay, you probably know about this. Yeah, all right. What qualifies a dinosaur to go on the ark if it happened to be the two types of dinosaurs that went on the ark? They were the lucky ones picked. What did they have to be like? What animals were on the ark? Were insects on the ark? No, because they don't qualify. Marine creatures don't need to be on the ark. Do microorganisms need to be on the ark? I'm asking that because a critic said that Noah was going to have to preserve all the microorganisms in the world. What? This is the kind of stuff that we get. Ridiculous stuff like this. These aren't serious questions. Because microorganisms can live outside the ark on log mats that are floating around from all the vegetation ripped up. Same with insects. They can survive outside the ark. And of course, marine creatures can easily survive outside the ark. But dinosaurs, to qualify to go on the ark, you had to breathe air and live on land. Did dinosaurs breathe air and live on land? Yeah, they did. So Noah would have to bring 2 of each unclean kind of dinosaur. What did he have to bring? All those big dinosaurs on the ark? Oh, some of you already know this. Babies can go on the ark. You don't need the big, huge Diplodocus on the ark. And there's supposed to be 1,000 species of dinosaurs. Do you need 1,000 times 2 for a male and a female? Is it 2,000 species? Are species the ones that go on the ark? A lot of you already know this. The Bible says kind. He took 2 of each kind. Well, what's a kind? Well, there's a whole research project in creation science called baraminology. Bara means created kind. So they're trying to find out the limits of the created kind. Now, we have a biological classification system that starts with species, which is supposed to be an interbreeding unit that only breeds within itself and not out. But they never hardly run the test. And we know that a lot of species breed with other species, like dogs can breed with wolves, which are different species. So their species concept is messed up. But the next level up is the genus level. The wolves are in one genus and the domestic dogs in another. No, that's not right. They're in different species of the genus Canis. So would that be the level, that average level of the kind going on the ark? John Woodmorop thought so, and he wrote a book about it. And he figured out how many genera, that's plural for genus, had to be on the ark. And he got a number of animals, I think, let's see. My memory, it's about 30,000 animals is all we needed on the ark. But most people who study this area, baraminology, and by the way, it's a very sophisticated area. They go into a lot of deep genetics. And they think now that the average level is at the next level up, the family level. So if the average kind is at the family level, then you only need a couple thousand animals in the ark. And from those animals, you have all the genes in the DNA for every organism that lived during the Ice Age and living now, that's spread out and diversified. And of course, the evolutionists give it a big term called microevolution, but I don't think it's any evolution whatsoever. It's a diversification, a genetic material built in at the beginning. And there's a lot of variety within genetic material in each organism, lots of variety. So, dinosaurs, we don't need 1,000 species. Generally, there's about 50 kinds of dinosaurs. They give them different species name, but they're generally the same thing with a little variability. And how can you run the test of interbreeding with a fossil? Fossils don't interbreed, so we don't know really what a species is. So it's a bunch of guesswork. So there's only about 50 kinds of dinosaurs. So you only need 100 dinosaurs on the ark. And here's that quote about how you qualify to get on the ark if you're an animal. And all flesh that moved on the earth perished, birds and cattle and beasts, and every swarming thing that swarms upon the earth, and all mankind. And all that was on the dry land, all in whose nostrils, had to have nostrils, was the breath of the Spirit of life, died. In other words, insects breathe through their skin, so you don't need insects on the ark. So a lot of animals don't qualify. And here's Triceratops up here. But there's a lot of variety within that type of organism. They're called Ceratopsia, and they have different horns and bony frills. That's that bone right in there. So there's different ones, and they give them lots of different names. So you only need 2 of these things on the ark. You don't need each one of these. And by the way, it's kind of interesting, this Torosaurus, which they thought was a different species, is actually an older Triceratops. They find glitches like that in their classification once in a while, so that shouldn't be a separate species. These are supposedly all separate species. So we only need about 50 kinds of dinosaurs. So they survived the flood. And therefore, they had to be roaming around after the flood. Were they roaming around after the flood? Whoa, I tell you, the secular scientists just razz us like crazy on this one. But we do have a lot of evidence that that is indeed the case. This is probably one of the best pieces of evidence. This is a temple in Cambodia that was built 800 years ago and then abandoned and covered up with vegetation. And there's bas reliefs carved into the blocks of this temple. And they can identify all these things on here except this one right here. 800 years ago. What does that look like? Stegosaurus. Now, this is such a unique animal that no one would be able to imagine drawing a creature like that unless they actually saw one, indicating that he saw a person who drew, the artisan that did this, actually saw a Stegosaurus. I think that's pretty good evidence. Of course, the secular scientists try to get out of this like crazy. They challenge everything we do, by the way. The soft tissue, it's interesting how they try to get out of that one. They have this in all these, they add a hypothesis to make it sound like, hey, we're working on it and we almost got it solved. That's what you would think. But like for the soft tissue, they're saying, well, it has hemoglobin in it, and hemoglobin has iron, and we think that this is Mary Schweitzer who did the research. She's trying to account for the millions of years. We think that the iron and the hemoglobin preserve that soft tissue somehow. But there's not a lot of iron in the hemoglobin to do that. So it's a shot in the dark. But that seems to be their best hypothesis that they can come up with to account for soft tissues in dinosaurs. And we've researched that. The Creation Research Society, we have a whole project called iDino. And that's where we found that Triceratops horn and found the bone cells and the soft tissue and stretchy stuff. And so we've done research on this to counter their ideas, and they don't work. But this is typical of them because they got to preserve their millions of years. They got to. They're stuck with it. And of course, a dinosaur is essentially a dragon is essentially an embellished dinosaur. So, you know that there's dragon legends all over the earth? The flag of Wales is a dragon on it. Where did they come from? Well, they probably saw dinosaurs after the flood. And so they embellished on them and made them like a dragon had fire coming out of their nostrils, so forth. And there's the flag of Wales. The Chinese have a lot of stories on dragons, so they're quite common. So it gives you an idea that, hey, there's some truth to this, and dinosaurs would fit the bill. And of course, the Bible talks about what apparently is dinosaurs in the Bible. There's two mysterious beasts in the book of Job, Behemoth and Leviathan. Leviathan almost seems like a marine reptile, but Behemoth especially is intriguing. It says in Job 40:15, look at the behemoth which I made along with you and which feeds on grass like an ox, God is saying to Job. He moves his tail like a cedar. Well, you know, the NIV Study Bible says, well, possibly the hippopotamus or elephant. Well, there's an elephant tail. Does that remind you of a cedar tree? Well, what about that tail of a hippo? Does that match? There's a cedar tree from Australia. Now, this is a tail that probably would fit like a cedar tree. Does it fit on an elephant? Well, what about a hippo? Oh, how about a diplodocus? Oh, that fits pretty good. So I think that the behemoth in Job is actually a sauropod dinosaur, like Diplodocus. And then it says his bones are tubes of bronze, his limbs are like rods of iron. Oh, would that describe it? That looks pretty powerful and strong. That's a diplodocus leg bone right there. And he's the chief of the ways of God. And of course, when they came off the ark, they hit the ice age, and some of them ended up like this, because the ice age occurred right after the flood. So, the Bible does explain dinosaurs. They're created with high design. They mostly died in the flood. Those leaving the ark struggled because of the ice age, the climate of the ice age, and man ended up probably finishing them off. It can be, and the challenging data can be explained by the beds model, briefly exposed diluvial sediments caused by a local drop in the level of the floodwaters, exposing the bedding plane of the sediments just laid down, and on that you can make the tracks, lay eggs, and scavenge dead dinosaurs, and then it comes up again and covers it all. So the Bible explains dinosaurs while evolutionists have many problems. Therefore, it is easy to believe the whole Bible. If we can believe the flood is a real event, we can believe the whole Bible, which tells us how to live here on earth and how to go to heaven. And what is that like, go to heaven? Well, I think to summarize, one verse in the New Testament kind of summarizes salvation. And that's Romans 10:9, which many of you have heard and probably have memorized. If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Now, these verbs are strong action verbs implying commitment, not intellectual assent. Confess with your mouth. Believe in your heart. These aren't just willy-nilly intellectual assent. These are commitments to Jesus as Lord and Savior. That's how you go to heaven. You will be saved. Anyway, I'm going to skip that. You see a lot of resources back there. Why are there so many resources? When I first got into this, there were about one or two. The reason is because our children, our grandchildren, and you are being hammered by the culture and challenged on many aspects, hundreds of earth science challenges. That's why we write sometimes technical monographs or technical articles in our journals. We have in-depth journals, and then we published non-scientific material, children's material. We have a lot of children's material to answer these questions because we have a lot of them, not dinosaurs, ape men. What about ape men, carbon-14, so forth. That's why we write, and I've written a fair amount of resources. I've published hundreds of articles in the creationist technical literature because the culture is hammering us. We're losing the young people. If you've seen any statistics, Answers in Genesis found that 2 out of 3 young people leaving church as they grow up out of high school leave the church. Leave the church. Why? Well, they did a poll, and it's the millions of years was the number one reason. Evolution was secondary, but these were top reasons why they left the church, and many will not come back. So we have a problem. And this is why this is an apologetics ministry to equip the church for ministry. That's why we write resources. And dinosaurs, we have a lot of books on dinosaurs because they use dinosaurs especially to hook the young people into millions of years, believing millions of years. And by the way, it starts in grade school. That's why Ken Ham named the book he wrote on this topic, Already Gone. They look like they're Christians, but in their mind they're already gone because the culture, especially from the schools, has kind of indicated that the Bible is a fairy tale. It can't explain real life observations out there in the real world. That's what they're telling them. That's the big message. That's why we have so many different resources. And of course, I've written 2 books on dinosaurs. This one is especially dealing with the the mystery of tracks, eggs, and nests, called Dinosaur Challenges and Mysteries. And I've written 5 children's books, not only the weather book, and also 2 Ice Age children's books, Life in the Great Ice Age, a fun read for children of cave people living in Germany next to the ice sheet, meeting Neanderthal men, going on a cave bear hunt, hunting woolly mammoth, in a fun read. I try to make these things fun. Then we have a sequel to that focusing on the extinction of the woolly mammoth called Uncovering the Mysterious Woolly Mammoth. But especially I find in geology is where they put it over on the young people, because they can say, well, the fossil record proves evolution. And how are you as an individual going to go out in the field and check the sedimentary rocks to find out if it's true or not? It's difficult. While in biology, you can show evolution's false easy because of the extreme complexity of everything. A cell is extremely complicated, more complicated than all the non-living parts of New York City, and you have trillions of cells all working together. So biology, I'd say it's easy to figure out that evolution is false, but geology is where they put it over. So I've written a children's book called Exploring Geology with Mr. Hibb, and now Exploring Dinosaurs with Mr. Hibb. Mr. Hibb is a cartoon character that, through cartoons and a fun read for young people, and even older people that wanted something easy. Anyway, I've written these things. Here's that Uncovering the Mysterious Woolly Mammoth, the sequel to Life in the Great Ice Age. Oops, what's going on here? And this is my latest book, because we have a passion for geology. We wanted to teach basic geology with Rob Carter and I, Biblical Geology 101, basic geology, so you can learn a little bit. And when you drive around, you can see evidence for the flood before your eyes and show your kids, aha, there's a flood feature. But unless you know about it, you couldn't say that. So this kind of opens your eyes. And then, of course, the deep time, the millions of years. Now, I wrote this book because a pastor came up to me and said, what we have on the dating methods is so complicated, even the simple stuff for laymen, that I can't understand it. So I wrote this book for a total layperson that has no scientific background. That was my aim. I don't know if I succeeded yet or not. This is a subtitle you can't see, The Deep Time Deception, Examining the Case for Millions of Years. That's actually the title I gave it, Examining the Case for Millions of Years, but they thought that was too lame. So the editor said, let's get something more dramatic out there, so I got that. Anyway, oh, yes, and for those that really want to know about evolution, I got 2 resources out there that aren't my own. They're about the only 2 that I haven't been involved in. And this is Evidence Against Evolution in 8 areas, fatal flaws of evolution from 15 PhD scientists, Evolution's Achilles Heels. There's a DVD and a book. And I want to leave you with this scripture quote. Your faith should not rest on the wisdom of men. That's what evolution is, trying to explain everything without God. Even the laws of physics they try to explain without God. The elements they have to explain without God. Everything. And it gets crazy after a while. And each step, a lot of times, is a lot of scientific difficulties that you can find if you dig deep. So your faith should not rest on what men say about how we got here, but on the power of God. For God, it's simple. If He can create the universe and everything in it in 7 days, the flood is a simple thing. Jonah being swallowed by a large fish, it's a simple thing with God. So that's where our faith should be, the power of God. So amen and thank you. And we'll have some questions and answers.
Thank you, Michael. And we will take some questions. So if you have a question, put your hand up and I'll come around. And while you're thinking of that,
I know this guy, by the way. We spent many days out in the field where I'd show the students all this geology out there. Sometimes we did it for 2 whole weeks. The students at Jackson Hole Bible College. Okay, Tim, what do you have for me?
Yeah, those were great field trips. Mike's a great teacher. So I wanted to ask a question kind of unrelated to your talk tonight, because I wonder if there might be people here wondering about the Ice Age. So it's 2 parts. What would you say is the best biblical evidence for an Ice Age? And what would you say is the best evidence in nature, particularly in geology, for an Ice Age?
Okay, number 1, what's the best evidence from the Bible? Well, you know that experts on the Ice Age can't explain it. It's too big of a climate change. You need temperatures of at least 50 degrees Fahrenheit cooling in the northern United States for a whole summer to get an Ice Age. Where are we going to get that? And by the way, they have a principle where they examine the rocks, the fossils, even the climate. They believe they can tell you the climate long ago from the rocks and fossils. And their method is called uniformitarianism. How many have heard that term? Okay, that's how that's their assumption for all geology is uniformitarianism. And so, but that doesn't work. What uniformitarian principle? Okay, I got to back up. Uniformitarianism is you use uniform processes or present processes we see going on today to explain all the rocks, the fossils, and the climate change. So what climate change our present process is going to tell us to get 50 degrees Fahrenheit for the northern United States to collect ice and snow year after year? Big problems. But the Bible can explain it because of the flood. The key thing is the flood. The flood caused the climate change after the flood to create the Ice Age. How? Well, you had massive volcanism, you had meteorite impacts, you had a lot of those processes would blast all these particles up in the air, and the fine particles would get up in the stratosphere and stay up there for years, up to 10 years, anywhere from 10 years depending on the size. And then during the Ice Age, you had a lot of volcanism going on. 700 stratovolcanoes, probably most of them are post-flood, putting up particles. So this volcanism would be powerful enough to cool the continents during the summer. That's where you get your cooling. But it's an interesting fact that the cooler the air, the drier it becomes. So if you get 50 degrees cooling, you've dried out the air something like 75%. So where's your moisture for the Ice Age to come from? Well, the flood, being a massive volcanic event, would have heated the water up. So the ocean water would have been a lot warmer than it is today. And the significance of that, the warmer the sea surface temperatures, the more rapid the evaporation. So not only will you get cooling of the continents after the flood, from the flood, but you'll get all this moisture. For instance, you can evaporate 7 times as much water vapor into the air at a temperature of 86 degrees Fahrenheit than at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, 7 times. And the major difference will be at mid and high latitudes, where it'll be caught up in storms and dumped on the land nearby for a rapid Ice Age. So the flood is a significant feature, and it'll persist year after year until it builds up to a maximum and then melts. I timed it by the cooling of the ocean, estimates of the timing of the cooling ocean, about 700-year Ice Age. So the flood is the key biblical evidence. And just the natural climatic effect of the flood, which is my field of atmospheric science from the University of Washington is where I got. I'm originally from Seattle. The second question was, geological evidence. Wow, there's a lot of that. I'd say erratic boulders might be one of the more significant ones. What is an erratic boulder? It's a boulder sitting out there on the surface that doesn't outcrop in that area. It did not come from there. It was transported from somewhere. And there's a lot of impressive erratics indicating that something transported it. And it wasn't necessarily water. Sometimes it can be, but some of these erratic boulders are huge. In fact, I hear there's a huge one around here in Lake Stevens. And so they were you find these erratic boulders all over through northern Montana, transported from pretty far away. A lot of these erratic boulders came on icebergs, like in the Lake Missoula flood, which I'll talk about tomorrow night.
Yeah.
When that broke, it carried a lot of rocks in icebergs all through the path, and I'll show you a plot of some of those in my talk tomorrow night. But that'd be one of the strongest evidence for glaciation is these erratic boulders.
And I was going to add to that, if you want all the evidence, he gave a talk on this last night. The Ice Age, only the Bible can explain it. And that was done at Calvary Chapel, Lake Stevens. It will be on their website and on our website as well in a few days. So that's the long answer.
I'm going to show you some erratic boulders. This is from my talk last night. Here is one southwest of Calgary, Alberta. Notice how angular it is. That's not going to roll down by water. This is the Okotoks erratics. It forms a trail of erratic boulders from near Jasper, Alberta, down to Cutbank, Montana. 600 kilometers. It's kind of a linear thing. And the only way you can emplace this is by an iceberg during the Ice Age. And this is a very spectacular one southwest of Portland, Oregon. It's like a shale, but it's been heated up some and metamorphosed. So it's a metamorphic rock. It's called an argillite. And this type of rock does not outcrop. By the way, this probably weighs 100 and some odd tons. This rock does not outcrop in the whole state of Oregon. This is a rock from western Montana caused by the Lake Missoula flood spreading down there and on an iceberg and dropping it 50 miles southwest of Portland, Oregon in the Willamette Valley. Here's a really interesting erratic boulder. This is called Bubble Rock in Acacia National Park in Maine. That's an erratic boulder put there by the Ice Age. So those are some erratic boulders.
Okay, if you have some other questions, raise your hand and I'll bring it around. Yep, one here.
So one of the questions was, Mary was saying that, my sister Mary was saying how the eggs, if a dinosaur laid an egg, it wouldn't have abandoned it because, I mean, any animal doesn't abandon its young for any reason. So that was one of the questions. My question was, I mean, honestly, if we look at a lot of a lot of the animals and things, I believe actually a lot of them during the Ice Age actually went to Siberia because a lot of the fossils that actually found are in that area. But a lot of the research that's also been found was a lot of plants grew in Siberia that it should have been frozen if an ice age had taken place, which must have been, Siberia must have been a warmer climate, meaning all the animals must have been in that section, and the warmer areas would have been cold.
Well, you asked several questions. Let's see. The first one, remind me of that. Okay, eggs, yes. Normally they wouldn't. In fact, they have found some dinosaurs on the eggs fossilized in Mongolia. But most of the time they do not find the mother dinosaur with the eggs. And they're laid flat on a bedding plane and mother's gone. They generally don't find the animal even nearby as a fossil. So what would cause the animal to abandon its eggs? Well, animals can get spooked, and I would say the encroaching floodwaters, which could be pretty noisy and daunting if you saw a big wall of water heading towards you. That might be enough for them to abandon their eggs, but they're not found in the fossil record next to their eggs. It's rare. There are 1 or 2 instances from Mongolia of that's the case. And then you mentioned Siberia. Were you referring to the woolly mammoths out there?
There are other fossils, not just woolly mammoths. There have been other fossils of dinosaurs in the area.
Yeah, there is. Probably the best area is Alaska. There's a lot of dinosaur fossils in Alaska. I've seen some of them. And I've seen dinosaur tracks in Alaska too. There's a huge amount of material in the north slope of Alaska along the Colville River. Lots of dinosaur fossils. They even found tracks there, and even saw a few baby dinosaurs there. They're rare, but they do find them in a few places. They find them in central Alaska. They find them in Denali National Park, which I've seen in some cases, and in southwest Alaska too. So, what in particular was your question with that?
Was it a warmer climate?
Oh, the warmth of the climate. Well, I believe after the flood it was warmer. And before the flood, the climate was warmer too, even at high latitudes. How was that? Well, it's interesting that the amount of coal we have in the ground, if the carbon in that coal is essentially compressed plant matter that lived before the flood. I mean, we're pre-flood and buried in the flood. They estimate the amount of coal, the carbon in the coal is approximately 10 times the amount of carbon in the current biosphere. All the plants and trees, there was 10 times, essentially it's saying there's 10 times as many trees and plants before the flood as there were now. What does that mean for the climate? Well, trees give off water vapor. Did you know that? It's called transpiration. In fact, 10% of the precipitation on the continents, the water vapor did not originate from the ocean, but from the leaves of plants and trees. It's called transpiration. And if you had 10 times the vegetation, you'd have a lot more water vapor in the air. What do you think that would do to the climate? You talk about climate change with that weak gas CO2. Water vapor is the major greenhouse gas by far. You add more water vapor to the air, you're going to have a warm climate. So the climate must have been warm before the flood. And you know, the fossils verify this. Even at high latitude, we find warm climate fossils. Antarctica, northeast Canada. We find warm climate animals, as well as the dinosaur tracks. So before the flood, it was probably a universal warm climate. You hardly see any frost rings in the tree rings of some of the trees. You hardly ever see a type of plant fossil from a desert. So the pre-flood climate was warm and globally, and lots of vegetation on the land. It was quite different, but we have hints. And in that book, How Noah's Flood Shaped the Earth, I talk about the pre-flood climate, and some of this data is in there. So yeah, the climate would have been warm before the flood, and it would have been warm after the flood, and the winters would have been a lot warmer in Siberia and Alaska. Why? Because of the warm Arctic Ocean and onshore flow of that warm water from the North Pacific and the Arctic. You might have been able to take a swim in the Arctic Ocean after the flood. It was so warm. And that would have kept those areas warm early in the Ice Age. The winters were mild, so we had mild winters, cool summers. And so a lot more animals can survive and even pass through Siberia into the Americas early in the Ice Age.
Okay, one last question.
Kind of dovetailing off of that, I had heard at one point in time, and I'm not sure if it's true, is that originally the Earth probably did not have the same axis tilt before.
Yes, okay, I've heard this one a lot.
And so, and all the meteor impacts and things like that, God used to help break up the crust and start plate tectonics and all that kind of stuff, could have possibly tilted the Earth, which would have been also contributed to the fact that it would have been more temperate and warmer before the flood, and after we have much more drastic season changes and things. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Okay, his question is, if we had a more vertical axis of our rotation, instead of 23.5, we'd have a warmer climate. Is that what you were?
Yeah, and less changes from fall to summer.
Yeah, right. You'd have a perpetual spring, in other words. Okay. Well, that's right in my field of atmospheric science. I get asked that question a lot. And I have published a little bit on that in some of my resources. But have you heard of that Johnny Horton song about north to Alaska? When it's springtime in Alaska, it's 40 below. A perpetual spring is going to be cold at the high latitudes. It's going to be a perpetual spring and cold. Ice will build up and build up and build up and gradually creep to mid-latitudes from the higher latitudes. So you'd actually create an ice age if you didn't have any vertical shift. It's actually the tilt that melts the ice in the higher latitudes, because the higher latitudes get 24 hours of sunlight, and it's sunshine that is the main factor to melt snow and ice, not temperature. It's sunshine is number one, temperature is secondary. And they get a powerful amount of sunshine in the summer at high latitudes. And that keeps us from actually having an ice age. And I don't think meteorite impacts, which we did have some in the flood, I think there was maybe about 1,000 of them. I've tried to estimate it. I've spent a lot of time working on impacts. And I don't think they're powerful enough to change the tilt of the earth by far. It just that takes a powerful amount of force to move it. Maybe if you got hit by an impact the size of Mars. And by the way, they believe that the moon was formed by a Mars-shaped impact of the earth early in the evolution of the earth. But an impact the size of Mars would, really be devastating. We had the largest impact was probably from an object about 20 or 30 kilometers in diameter. The craters are the Vredefort crater in South Africa and the Sudbury crater in Ontario. Probably were from asteroids 15 to 30 kilometers in diameter. Those are probably the biggest ones. But we did have them, but they're not big enough to change the tilt of the earth.